Okay, so get this. Someone sent us this YouTube video, and it's called A Scientist Examines 3 Bible Prophecies That Came True. Mind-blowing.
Fetchy title.
Right. And it's an interview with this guy, Dr. Hugh Ross. He's like an astrophysicist and a Christian apologist.
Interesting combo.
Yeah, right. So he makes some pretty bold claims about the Bible in this video. So we're going to dive into those claims and see what we think.
Sounds good.
Okay, so Dr. Ross starts off by saying that, like, the Bible is totally unique because it, like, accurately predicts all these historical events, right?
Okay.
And he's like, other religious texts, not so much.
Mm-hmm.
He even calls out Mormonism specifically, saying it's got, like, over 50 failed prophecies.
Well, that's a bit of a loaded statement, isn't it? I mean, how do you even start comparing prophecies across different religions?
Right. Like, where do you even begin?
Yeah, because every religion's got its own way of interpreting prophecies. You know,
Yeah.
It's like comparing apples and oranges, really.
Totally, totally. Like, how do you verify, like, the age and authenticity of, say, Mormon texts compared to the Bible?
Exactly. And even then, how do Mormons themselves interpret those prophecies?
Right, right.
It's not exactly a fair comparison if everyone's playing by different rules, you know?
Okay, so maybe comparing religions like that isn't the best approach. So let's focus on a specific example that Dr. Ross brings up, okay? The Book of Daniel.
Ah, Daniel.
Yeah, so he says that the Book of Daniel, like, predicts the rise and fall of all these different empires, like Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans.
Right, the empires.
Yeah. So what do you think about that? Like, is there any historical backing to that claim?
Well, the Book of Daniel, now that's a fascinating one. Dating it, though, is like trying to solve a really, really complicated puzzle, you know?
Yeah.
So, like, some scholars say that it was definitely written before the events that it describes, right? And they point to things like linguistic evidence and its inclusion in the Septuagint.
Hold on, the Septuagint.
Yeah.
What's that?
Oh, sorry. The Septuagint is like an ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, right?
Okay.
From like way back in the 2nd century BC.
Got it.
So because the Septuagint includes the Book of Daniel, the argument is that Daniel must have been written before that. You know
Makes
what I mean?
sense.
But there's another group of scholars that believe that, no, it was actually written much later, maybe even like during the 2nd century BC.
Okay.
And they say that it was kind of like using knowledge of the past to make it seem like prophecy. You know?
Oh, interesting.
So it's a pretty big debate.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So basically, we're stuck. No clear answer on when it was actually written.
Yeah, pretty much. It shows just how tricky it can be to interpret these ancient texts, you know?
Yeah, for sure. So, okay. Let's just put the whole dating thing aside for a second. Because one of the most, like, dramatic details that Dr. Ross points to is this prophecy about Alexander the Great.
Right, Alexander.
Yeah. So Daniel supposedly predicts Alexander's death. And not just any death, but, like, his death at the height of his power. Wow.
And then it goes on to say that his empire gets split up amongst his 4 generals.
Right.
Like, come on, is that too perfect?
Well, that's where the whole historical context thing comes in, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you think about it, how many times in history have empires kind of fallen apart after a strong leader died?
Right. That's great.
It wasn't exactly like a rare occurrence. So, yeah, there are parallels to the Book of Daniel, right? But skeptics might say that it's more of a historical pattern than like a straight up, supernatural prophecy.
Okay, so maybe empires falling apart isn't that unusual.
Right.
But what about Psalm 22? Now, this one really got me.
Oh, yeah. What about it?
So Dr. Ross presents it as this like super detailed prediction of the Messiah's crucifixion.
Okay.
Even though it was supposedly written like centuries before Jesus.
Right.
Crazy, right?
Psalm 22. Yeah, it's a really powerful piece of writing. It talks about a lot of suffering. Like, it talks about the piercing of hands and feet.
Yeah.
Mockery. And even some of the phrases that Jesus said on the cross, right? Like, echoes those phrases. But, okay, here's the thing that blows my mind. Crucifixion wasn't even a thing back then.
Right.
When the song was supposedly written.
Right.
Right. So what's up with that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if Psalm 22 truly came before crucifixion, it really makes you wonder how it could like foreshadow all those specific details,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So again, the timing of when this psalm was written becomes super important
Right.
to understand, just how significant it is as a prophecy.
It's like we're playing this dating game with all these texts.
Yeah. It's a crucial part of figuring all of this out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some scholars, they place Psalm 22 with King David, like around 1000 BC,
Okay.
which would put it, way before crucifixion,
Yeah.
centuries. But then you've got others who say, nope, it was written much, much later, maybe during or even after the Babylonian exile, which would put it in like the 6th century BC.
So we're back to square one. Different interpretations, no clear answers. Okay, so let's set aside the whole dating debate for a moment, because there's another layer to all of this prophecy stuff, right? What if Jesus just like staged the fulfillment of these prophecies?
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Like, what if he knew about them beforehand and he just kind of played it out?
Right, like he knew the script.
Exactly.
That's definitely a question that a lot of skeptics ask.
All right, makes sense.
I mean, if you know what's supposedly going to happen, it's a lot easier to make it happen, you know?
Yeah. But Dr. Witt has a counter-argument for that too, right? Like, he points to things like Judas's betrayal,
right?
The whole 30 pieces of silver thing.
Yeah.
And then using that money to buy a burial ground. And his argument is that these events, like, they were totally outside of Jesus's control.
Well,
which makes it harder to believe that it was all staged, right?
That's an interesting point. It really comes down to how much control we think Jesus actually had over those events. You know, were they really completely out of his hands, or were they, you know, part of some bigger preordained plan?
Right.
That's a question that gets into all sorts of like theological debates about free will and divine intervention and all that.
Deep stuff.
Yeah, deep stuff.
So we've got prophecies, potential stagings. It's a lot to untangle.
It is. It is. But to kind of, you know, try and support his point, Dr. Ross brings up another example, the story of Bar Kokhba.
Bar Kokhba.
Yeah, have you heard of him?
I don't think so.
Okay. So he was this Jewish leader who he led this revolt against the Romans back in the 2nd century AD.
Okay.
And some people even thought he was the Messiah, but in the end, his rebellion failed.
Right.
So Dr. Ross uses Bar Kokhba as an example of what he calls a fake Messiah.
Okay.
To contrast with what he sees as the genuine fulfillment of prophecies in Jesus.
So we're comparing Jesus to a rebel leader.
In a way, yeah. It's all about showing different perspectives, right? But when we're talking about figures like Bar Kokhba and Jesus who lived so long ago, how do we know what's real and what's not?
That's true.
And how do we account for like biases when we're reading these historical accounts?
Yeah, good point.
It's important to keep those questions in mind.
This is getting more and more interesting by the minute.
It is, right.
We're talking about history, we're talking about theology, we're talking about the nature of belief itself.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
It was fascinating.
It really is. You know, one thing that kind of stuck with me from Dr. Ross's argument was this idea that, like, some prophecies would be totally irrelevant if the Messiah hadn't come already.
Oh, interesting.
Like they have a built-in expiration date or something.
That's a really interesting way to put it.
Right.
Yeah.
He uses that whole 30 pieces of silver thing to illustrate this point.
Right, right.
Like, think about it. If the Messiah was going to show up today, you know, in a world with, like, Bitcoin and Apple Pay.
Exactly.
The whole silver thing just wouldn't make sense.
It wouldn't have the same impact at all.
Right. It'd be like, here's 30 Bitcoin. Like, what?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
It just goes to show how important it is to think about the historical and cultural context of these prophecies, you know.
Totally.
What might seem totally random or outdated to us today could have been super meaningful back then.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so speaking of context, let's talk about Dr. Ross's interpretation of the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9.
All right.
The one about, like, the timing of the Messiah's arrival.
Right.
He connects it to a decree from a Persian king, right?
Yeah, he focuses on this decree from King Artaxerxes.
Okay.
Back in 457 BC.
Got it.
Which basically allowed the Jews to rebuild Jerusalem.
Okay.
And Dr. Ross, he interprets those 69 sevens that are mentioned in Daniel 9.25 as weeks of years.
Weeks of years, okay.
And he does all this math and says that this period, starting from that decree, would lead to a date around 30 AD.
Which is, like,
roughly the time of Jesus' ministry.
Okay, so 457 BC plus 483 years equals 30 AD. Sounds pretty straightforward, but is there any wiggle room in those calculations at all?
Well, like a lot of things with biblical interpretation, it's not quite that simple.
Right.
Not everyone agrees that those sevens should be interpreted as weeks of years, you know.
Okay.
And there's even debate about which specific decree in the book of Ezra the prophecy is even talking about.
Oh, wow.
And then on top of all that, trying to pinpoint the exact year of Artaxerxes' decree. Tricky.
Yeah.
Because we've got different ancient calendar systems, historical records.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah, Dr. Ross's calculations might work out neatly on paper, but other scholars have totally different timelines and interpretations, you know.
So even with, like, a seemingly specific prophecy like this, there's still room for debate.
Exactly. It just reminds us that biblical interpretation, it's not always black and white. There's all these layers of historical context, linguistic nuances, different theological viewpoints.
Right, it's not just like a simple math equation.
Nope, not at all.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit here and talk about the story of the Magi.
Okay, the Magi.
Yeah, and their journey to Bethlehem. Dr. Ross really seemed to emphasize how, like, geographically close Bethlehem is to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Like, making their journey seem, you know, more believable.
Right. He was drawing on his own experiences in the Holy Land to kind of highlight that.
Yeah.
He was saying the trip from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, it could have been done in just a few days.
Okay, but here's the thing that I don't get. The video mentions that the Magi were aware of Daniel's prophecy about the timing of the Messiah.
Okay.
So if they knew about that prophecy, why were they, like, surprised to find Jesus already born in Bethlehem? Shouldn't they have, like, known when to show up?
That's a really good question. And it's something that has puzzled a lot of scholars and interpreters.
Right.
Because if they were following Daniel's prophecy, it does seem odd that they didn't arrive in Bethlehem until after Jesus' birth.
Right. Like, did they miss their flight? Or was their GPS messed up?
Huh. Well, maybe not quite like that, but there are some more serious interpretations out there.
Okay.
Like some people suggest that the star they were following, it might have appeared later.
Okay.
Maybe it was signifying a different event in Jesus's life.
Yeah.
Like his presentation at the temple, you know?
So even something that seems like pretty straightforward, like the Magi's journey, still has all these layers of interpretation and debate.
It seems like nothing with biblical prophecy is ever simple, is it?
Right. Like we're going down this rabbit hole and it just keeps going and going.
It's the beauty of it, though, isn't it? These ancient texts, they're complex, they're multifaceted.
Yeah.
And they really make us think on all these different levels.
There's always something more to uncover, more to think about.
Exactly.
So we've spent like a good chunk of time talking about Dr. Ross and his take on all this biblical prophecy stuff.
We have.
But like, what's it all mean for us, you know, like in the big picture?
That's the real question, isn't it? We've been looking at all these specific prophecies and like how people interpret them.
Right.
But how does all of this like actually affect how we see history or faith or even, you know, our search for meaning?
It's like we're zooming out now.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like we've been putting together this massive puzzle, focusing on all the individual pieces, right?
Yeah.
Their shapes, their colors.
Yeah.
And now we're finally stepping back to see like the whole picture.
Right.
You know, for some people, when they see these prophecies being fulfilled, it strengthens their faith.
Makes sense.
It's like proof that the Bible is divinely inspired.
Yeah.
It reinforces this idea that there's a God out there who's actively shaping history.
Right, right.
Guiding human destiny.
But I can also see how for some people, like, all this prophecy stuff could actually raise more questions than answers.
Oh, absolutely. Like, skeptics might look at these prophecies and say, well, that's just a coincidence, or that's a misinterpretation, or even like, that was just made up after the fact.
Right.
They might question, you know, how reliable these ancient texts really are.
Yeah.
And they might point out that interpretation is, like, inherently subjective. Everyone brings their own baggage to the table.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay, so then how do we, like, navigate all these different viewpoints?
It's tough, right?
Yeah.
It's like walking a tightrope between faith and reason.
It really is.
But I think there are a few things that can help us, you know, stay balanced.
Okay, like what?
Well, first off, I think it's got to be intellectual honesty.
Okay.
Like, we have to be willing to look at the evidence with a critical eye.
Right.
Acknowledge that there are going to be some gray areas, some things we just don't know for sure.
Right.
And, like, avoid just focusing on information that supports what we already believe.
Yeah, that's good advice for, like, pretty much everything in life, not just biblical prophecy.
Exactly. And then second, I think a little bit of humility goes a long way.
Okay.
Like recognizing that we don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Our interpretations are always going to be influenced by our own experiences and perspectives.
That's true.
So we got to be open to hearing other people's viewpoints and be willing to, like, question our own assumptions.
So intellectual honesty, humility. What's the third thing?
I think the third thing is just being willing to have those tough conversations with people who disagree with us.
Okay.
You know, even when we don't see eye to eye, we can still learn from each other.
Right.
We can gain a deeper understanding of, like, all these complicated issues.
Yeah.
If we just shut down the conversation or dismiss people who think differently, it doesn't help anyone.
Yeah, it's like Dr. Ross was saying.
Right.
Being open to engaging with skeptics and actually having those tough conversations.
Exactly. It's all about recognizing that disagreeing respectfully can be just as valuable as, agreeing completely.
So we've talked about a lot.
We have.
But what are the big takeaways here?
I think more than anything, what we should walk away with is a sense of curiosity and wonder.
Okay.
Like whether you're a believer or a skeptic or somewhere in between.
Yeah.
These prophecies really make us think about these big questions.
Yeah.
About history, about faith, about what it means to be human.
It's like we're being encouraged to embrace the mystery, not just try to solve it.
Exactly. There's no one right answer when it comes to interpreting biblical prophecy.
Right.
It's a journey.
Yeah.
And the path is going to be different for everyone.
So if this whole deep dive has sparked your curiosity, what should you do? Where do you go from here?
Well, you could definitely check out Dr. Ross's work.
Okay.
He's got a ton of resources on his website, reasonsroddy.org.
Right.
But don't just stop there. Do your own research.
Right.
Talk to people who have different viewpoints and then come to your own conclusions.
Yeah.
Based on, what makes sense to you.
And even if you don't find all the answers,
right,
the journey itself is a really cool experience.
Totally. Who knows? Maybe you'll be the one to crack the code on some of these ancient prophecies.
Well, this has been an awesome deep dive.
It has.
We've talked about so much.
So much.
We've examined the arguments. We've looked at the evidence.
Yep.
And we've really wrestled with all the complexities of faith, history, and interpretation.
It's been a journey.
It really has. But most importantly, I hope that we've sparked a little bit of wonder in you and encouraged you to keep exploring these big questions.
Absolutely.
It's been a pleasure having you with us on this journey of discovery.
Thanks for having me.
And a huge thank you to you, our listener, for diving deep with us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never stop wondering.